Hey everyone, Tankenstein here. This video is a first for me as it is essentially an updated review of an older review that I did of the Khalid. This new review, however, is 100% necessary, as when I initially reviewed the Khalid, it was much weaker in that it had access only to the L23 APFSDS as its best solid shot shell, whereas now it has access to the substantially better L23 APFSDS. Because of this addition to the Khalid, it plays much differently and is a substantially better tank than when it lacked the APFSDS. Further, the gunner's optics have been increased from 8x zoom at max to 10x zoom. While some portions of this review will remain similar or even the same, such as in regards to overall survivability, the essence of how good this tank is, as well as how it plays, is totally different, and thus this will be a substantially updated review. But with that initial statement out of the way, let's get into the review. Now to start, as always, I'll place the stat card here on the side of the screen. Things to note are its horsepower, armor, and new L23 APFSDS shell. Now for how the Khalid plays. Since it was buffed, the Khalid is now almost like a mix of the Chieftain Mk.5 and Mk.10, with the vehicle itself being based on the Mk.5, though having the enhanced APFSDS of the Mk.10. Further, the Khalid has an enormous amount more horsepower, with 1200 in total, which is around 50% higher than what's found in the Mk.5 at best, granting the Khalid an over 20 horsepower per ton power to weight ratio. This puts it in line with other similar BR tanks and negates the main weakness of the Chieftain in that it is typically slow and lacks maneuverability. Regardless, the Khalid is essentially a Chieftain Mk.5/10 hybrid with a huge boost in mobility, which opens up new worlds of gameplay. Funny enough, the Khalid, with its enhanced horsepower and 120mm cannon with APFSDS, is now somewhat similar to the Leopard A1A1L44, except with much better armor, at least towards the front, and lacking the Leopard's thermal sights. With this said, the Khalid has the ability to flank and spank, being able to reach points of interest faster than many other tanks, and also pen most enemies from any angle, being that it now has upwards of 400mm of armor pen at max, again with its L23 APFSDS shell. This, along with its very good frontal turret, which has up to 280mm of armor, actually allows the Khalid to be a makeshift brawler. Though of course I would avoid doing this, as the Khalid also features a relatively mediocre reload speed, turret reverse speed, and also has average non-composite armor away from front of the turret. I would advocate for sniping with the Khalid due to its ability to reach points of interest and its very powerful armament, but it has a middling to fairly decent 10x zoom for the gunner's optic, which isn't bad in and of itself, but it also lacks thermal sights. While these two things aren't themselves too big of issues, other tanks around this BR tend to have thermals and have similar or even better gunner's optics, which puts you into a comparative disadvantage insofar as target acquisition is concerned. Because of this, I would say that sniping is definitely possible and possibly even a great way to play this tank, but you really need to make sure that you pay attention, as technology will not aid you as much in this vehicle as it will with other vehicles. But put concisely, now that the Khalid has an essentially transformative APFSDS shell at its disposal, I would place the roles of this tank as a flanker first, though it could also function competently as a sniper and can even act as a brawler if it needs to, though you will need to angle your vehicle and make sure that your weak spots, such as the lower glacis and sides, are protected. Now with all that said, let's get into its strengths and weaknesses, and first for its strengths. As an excellent 120mm cannon paired with the great L23 APFSDS shell, meaning that you can get over 400mm of armor pen at max and increased post-pen damage compared to what most 105mm cannons will fire. Second, the Khalid has fairly good to very good maneuverability and speed. Third, it has a great reverse speed of up to 37 km per hour, with great acceleration to boot. For its fourth strength, even though this is pretty common at this BR at this point, the Khalid has a laser rangefinder. For its fifth strength, the Khalid has very good vertical guidance of between -10 and +20 degrees, which allows for excellent hold down positioning and the ability to angrily shoot off helicopters. Beyond this, it has smoke grenades and access to a smoke shell. For its seventh strength, it has decent enough armor all around the vehicle, with the front of the turret being up to 280mm of armor. Beyond this, the Khalid has fantastic neutral steering, and finally, it has premium RP and SL bonuses. Now with that said, for its weaknesses. For its first weakness, it has a mediocre reload of between 7.5 and 9.75 seconds, depending of course on crew skill. For its second weakness, the Khalid has a mediocre to average turret traverse speed. Third, it lacks thermals. While thermals are not guaranteed at this BR, they are still becoming much more common to the point where not having them is a disadvantage. And finally, the Khalid lacks an HMG, but at least the Khalid has 2 LMGs with one being on top of the turret. Now with all that being said, let's get into how I score this vehicle. And first, for armament, I give the Khalid a 7.5 out of 10. The inclusion of APFSDS has revolutionized this vehicle and its armament. It went from having a sub 300mm APDS shell as its best shell that wasn't a Heat FS shell to being an above average APFSDS shell with over 400mm of armor pen at max. This means that you no longer have to choose between the Heat FS, which would typically be stopped by ERA and composite armor, and a poor APDS shell for a 9.0 BR tank. Because of this, the Khalid can now match or exceed the armament of many other tanks at this BR. Unfortunately, it still suffers from some deficiencies that take away from this score, such as having a relatively slow reload, having a mediocre turret traverse, and of course lacking thermals. Further, the Khalid lacks an HMG, which will limit its effectiveness versus aircraft and lightly armored vehicles. Otherwise, the inclusion of that L23 APFSDS has made all the difference in the world for this vehicle and has taken it from being a 0 and turned it into a hero. For reference, my previous score in the armament category for the Khalid in my original review was a 3.5 out of 10. While it still is not the best in-game at this BR, the armament of the Khalid has taken a tremendous stride and is now among the best tanks at and around this BR for armament. With that said, for mobility, I give it a 6.5 out of 10. The mobility on the Khalid is touted to be one of its strongest attributes, largely because it takes the Chieftain Mk.5 and nearly doubles its engine power, though with a slight increase in weight. Because of this, the Khalid has around a 50% increase in power to weight ratio, which at 9.0 BR makes it fairly average, though still a touch above average relative to other medium tanks and MBTs at this BR. In some ways, this is almost what polishing a turret looks like. The Chieftain is regarded as one of the least mobile tanks in its class at this BR, and the upgraded 1200 horsepower simply takes it from being poor to being pretty good, and maybe even great depending on how you look at it. By no means, however, does it turn the Khalid into something that will challenge a light tank, or the likes of something like an XM1 or the OF40. Coming from the Chieftain's lineage, it is actually quite surprising that this vehicle is as mobile as it is, and is definitely one of the brightest spots on this tank. Now that said, for survivability, I give it a 6 out of 10. The survivability on the Khalid is a somewhat mixed bag. On one hand, it has among the strongest conventionally armored turret faces at and around this BR, with 280mm of armor in that area. On the other hand, the Khalid has an average 4-man crew size, a large weak spot in a fairly weak upper glacis, and subpar to poor armor around the rest of the tank, with no composite or ERA anywhere on this vehicle. In a good hold down position, the Khalid has a tremendous amount of survivability, including against autocannons from the front. Otherwise, it's fairly average compared to most vehicles at this BR. Unfortunately, due to its increasingly powerful armaments of most tanks that the Khalid will fight, the turret armor will be negated in many instances, sans ricochets or a random non-pen. While the Khalid is slightly more survivable than most tanks at this BR, it isn't nearly as survivable as, for example, a Merkava Mark II-D. The Khalid is just thick enough up front and nowhere else. Now that said, for overall, I give it a 7 out of 10. The main thing that I look at insofar as a tank is concerned is its firepower first, with mobility and survivability coming in a tie for second place in terms of importance. As such, and as mentioned before, the L23 APFSDS shell has made a world of difference in the Khalid. This vehicle is now not only viable, but also a great option to purchase. While I personally prefer the Rurocat 105 over the Khalid as I value the additional speed on the Rurocat versus the sometimes questionable armor on the Khalid, I feel that most people will like the Khalid a little bit more as a grinder of the British ground tech tree because it is more versatile and can handle more types of playstyles. The Khalid has a fantastic armament, very good mobility, and fairly decent survivability, despite lacking both composite armor and ERA. And all this vehicle is now a stalwart, and it does its tech tree proud. Now with that said, for my recommendation, should you purchase the Khalid? I never thought I'd say it, but the buff to the Khalid has made this vehicle into a true competitor and is part of one of the best 1-2 punch premium tank combos in War Thunder, as you can also purchase the Rurocat 105. Ultimately, while I genuinely like and almost love the Khalid, with its excellent firepower and mobility, it also lacks thermals, which are becoming increasingly common around this BR, which is essentially again a disadvantage to not have them. Aside from that gripe, and some of the smaller issues laid out earlier in this video, I still thoroughly enjoy the Khalid and can easily recommend it for purchase and give it my Tankenstein seal of approval. While I would personally pick the Rurocat 105 first, again due to its speed and thermals, the Khalid is neck and neck with it, and is likely to be the tank that more people would prefer. Plus, being that the Khalid is 8910 GE, it's also less expensive than the Rocat 105, as an 8910 GE costs essentially around $45 USD, whereas at least currently, you have to purchase the Rocat 105 in a pack that costs $60 USD, but of course this includes 14 days of premium time plus 2000 GE. Regardless, the Khalid feels like a new tank, and is definitely one that would be a solid choice if you decide to purchase it. Now with that said, thank you all so much for watching this video. Please of course consider liking, commenting, subscribing. Let me know what you guys thought about this video in the comments below, especially being that this is a first for me, being that it's a totally new review for the most part about a vehicle that I've already reviewed in the past, even recently. But either way, thanks again, and I'll see you all on the other side. Take care, everyone.